It's truly my pleasure to introduce our keynote tonight, Dr. John Amaechi. It's really been fascinating to follow his career, and I'm going to let you take a look at the app where there's a very extensive and, might I say, illustrious biography that's on there that can give you some detail as to just what this man has accomplished. But I'm going to really stick to some personal anecdotes and the impact that following him has done for me. So looking at him as a player, as he transitioned from, it was rare enough to see a British NBA basketball player, who knew, okay? But it was quite another to see him transition post-career in deciding to become a psychologist. And then to take that, all of his knowledge, and dedicate himself to changing communities. And indeed, I hope tonight, changing the way we view our sector. I really wanted John to kick us off in Toronto. We handpicked him specifically because I really hope he's going to prompt you to think about the role that you play in the sportscape and to really be proud of the role that you might play, whether it's as a leader, a disruptor, a critical mind, a builder, whatever role you may play, but really take a closer look at what you're doing, because we are living and we are working in strange times and challenging times. And I really think that more than ever, it's time to use this unlimited potential for social change in our beautiful sector of sport. So it's never been any better time to do so than now, and I hope you will. So without any further ado, welcome Dr. John Amaechi. Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Hello, everybody. Curious distribution, but sure. It's always fascinating watching people file into a massive room to see what they choose to do. Standing at the back just in case this is just crap and you want to escape. I understand. I've been there. It's hard for me to sneak out of a room. So half of you are going to love this and half of you are going to hate this, which is excellent. It's what it should be. My sister tells me that I'm a polarizing character. People either love me or they hate me. And I remind my sister day in and day out that I'm 6'9" and 300 and odd pounds. And I don't care either way. It's fine. But I do think we need to have a little rethink about sport if we want to do the right thing by it and maintain our sanity in the process. I've rewritten this speech more than I've rewritten any other speech that I've given in the last probably 5 years. This is a version from about 3:10 this morning, which was prompted by a conversation with a group of grad students and conference attendees yesterday, mixed with a newer version from about 2:00 this afternoon after a conversation with an old friend. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be a bit of a mishmash. The grads I spoke to yesterday encouraged me to be provocative, and so that's what I'm going to do. Hopefully you'll engage in the Q&A, and that way we can have a proper conversation. If you think that I'm great, then you can say so. And if you think I'm terrible, then you should say so. I'm not a sports psychologist. I'm a chartered organizational psychologist in the UK. So I come from this at a slightly different angle. I'm also a fellow in the Royal Society for Public Health, and I'm a director of, in the UK, we have a terrible thing called the NHS, which is free care at the point of your actual care, which is terrible. But I'm a director of a hospital there that's got 20,000 staff, and I'm really interested in how we can help people to thrive better. So I suppose my perspective is a mishmash of a lot of these different things. I also played some sport, and that is not worth talking about. I'm going to pause here because there's an interesting thing that happens when people hear me speak. Initially, English people expect me to be American, and Americans just don't expect any of what's coming out of my mouth to be coming out of my mouth. It's all wrong because all British people look like Rupert Everett or something. So I'm just giving you a chance to catch up, and then we'll continue. My kind of day job is a psychological consultancy that works with lots of different people, and I thought I'd start here. We work with a lot of different organizations, from investment banks, intelligence services from lots of different countries, big retailers, professional services. And I just want to state this, and this will hurt, I hope. Investment banks have made more credible gains in internal culture change, inclusion, authentic leadership, clamping down on internal bullying and harassment in the last 10 years than sport. Investment banks are better than us. I hope we realize what an incredibly low bar this is. It's a critically low bar. But they've made better gains. Even on just the inclusion front, what they've done, sport can't hold a candle to. Yes, there's 0.01% black leaders within banks, but that's still higher than the NCAA. Sport is not living up to its promise, and it makes a lot of promises. And so I spent some time on the computer in the lobby there, printing off stuff that I should know by heart by now. One's a mission statement and some of the we believe statements from the Association of State High School Athletic Associations, where they talk about what they believe sport is in schools. It promotes respect, integrity, and sportsmanship. It prepares for the future in a global community, that's grand, develops leadership and life skills, fosters the inclusion of diverse populations, promotes healthy lifestyles and safe competition, encourages positive school community culture, and I love this. The last one is the only conditional statement they have there, which is that it should be fun. When you move on to the NCAA, they have 3 priorities, only 3. Not one of them is sport, so we know automatically this is real. Their 3 priorities are academics, well-being, and fairness. When you look at their core values, their first one is the collegiate model of athletics is one of their core values, which is spurious. But apparently, this is where students participate in sport as an avocation. Avocation is a wonderful old-fashioned British word. I approve of its use, just it has to be contextual. Avocation means hobby. Does anybody think that sport in the NCAA is a hobby? If you're not getting paid, I suppose it is by definition. Other core values, the pursuit of excellence in both academics and athletics. An inclusion culture that fosters equitable participation for student athletes and career opportunities for coaches and administrators from diverse backgrounds. We move on to the IOC. They're always a good laugh. The pinnacle, for many of us, of what sport's supposed to stand for, and one of the largest promulgators of the sporting myth. Their fundamental principles of Olympianism, to place sport at the service of harmonious development of humankind, the view to promoting a peaceful society concerned with the preservation of human dignity, which is why they put Olympics in Russia, I suppose. FIFA has a very similar thing, which is why they have an event coming up in Qatar, I suppose. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind, which requires a mutual understanding of the spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. The enjoyments and rights and freedoms set forth in the Charter must be secured without discrimination of any kind, such as race, color, sex, sexual orientation, language, religion, political, or other. And belonging to the Olympic movement requires compliance to these. You can look through the charters, the mission statements of any organization you care to, from your most lowly grassroots sport for development organization all the way up through the NBA, the big four sports in this country, the Premier League, and in the United Kingdom, and you will find these rich statements written again and again and again. My challenge is, if this is what the promise is, how come we can say with some conviction that investment banks and professional services are making more progress? I think we take it for granted that sport is going to be good, and I think we need to challenge that. I was part of a duty of care review for the House of Lords with a woman called Tanni Grey-Thompson. She's one of the most famous Paralympians in the world. She's a remarkable woman, a mentor of mine, and a genius. You learn by osmosis just being around her. And we did this duty of care review over the course of a year and a half. It was released on a Friday at 4 o'clock in the midst of a bunch of other Brexit news, because the government really didn't want people to be reading what we'd found out. But it was pretty devastating. And it's clear to me that sport's become a space that's detached from reality, like a virtual Mount Olympus. We somehow apply a different set of rules and a different context to us. And that's really dangerous, because I think we have to hold on to reality as practitioners in this space to make sure that we can do our job properly, to be as vigilant and fulsome in our defense of the young people and the adults who participate in sport. Some of the things that we discovered are this. Sport is a space where some of our least qualified men, and they are mostly men, are given unfettered access to some of our most vulnerable young people. Quite literally, in the space of sport, your entire qualification for unfettered access to a young person can be, I used to be good at this. Even in places where there is education, and I should put air quotes around that, for coaches. In the UK, you can become what they call a level 3 sports coach in football with 2 weekends and a logbook. Good luck finding a teacher who's as unqualified as that. It's kind of interesting that we've detached the moniker of educator from our sports coaches, I think, to the danger of our young people. Well, I talked about vulnerable adults, and I think that's really important too. Vulnerable children and vulnerable adults. We actually have a definition of vulnerable adult, and one of the things that our duty of care report talked about was how we should actually think about young people in sport very differently than we think about young people in almost any other context. And not just because so much of sport for development is young people coming from what we call disadvantaged or underserved or whatever environments with multiple family stresses often. Not just because of that, but because when you're in the context of sport, it makes you more vulnerable. Our definition of vulnerable in a legal framework, of course I can't find it now because I wrote it somewhere else, but I think it's important to mention, is a person who is or may be unable to protect themselves against serious harm or exploitation. I would challenge you not to be able to apply that to almost any athlete in any organized sport. Whether their draw to that environment simply be the sense of belonging that makes them feel if they weren't in that, their identity dissipates, or whether it be that their scholarship and the promise of a route out of nothingness dissipates. In that environment, you can be coerced into almost anything. I'll talk a little bit about my experience with that later on. I need to say some things here that will be unpalatable, if what I've already said isn't already kind of unpalatable. We have to consider our roles in the context of a system that is not optimized for the benefit of the young people. The system of sport is not optimized for the well-being of the student athletes. Indeed, student athlete in many scenarios is a laughable label. There are some institutions out there that are no better than a 21st century plantation. Young people who are unpaid, prohibited from unionization, reminded on a regular basis how they should be grateful for the education they're allowed, unable to move freely from one place to another without some form of sanction or permission. I challenge you to give me a better definition than 21st century plantation. And yes, I mean institutions like the NCAA. They are environments where people are vulnerable to coercion, manipulation. Athletes are vulnerable to coercion and manipulation. They are environments where we, as practitioners, are especially important, because we could be in a situation where we, as practitioners, are the only people in their environment who can see through the mythology, see through the clutter, and realize that our stakeholder is them. Not our school, not our institution, not our overarching body, IOC or otherwise, but the young person. This is how vital you are in this link. My sports psychologist is here today, Dave Eukelson from Penn State. One of many people who provided an ecosystem around me that helped me be the plural kind of person that I knew I had to be, who helped me manage through the death of my mother, who helped me survive in a foreign country. Dave and Sandy and many other people who were advisors and mentors to me in that period were essential for my survival. And I know that many of you realize that's the power you have, but sometimes our ability to do that job is clouded by the mythology around the sport that we love, the sports environment that we love and respect, that Mount Olympus picture that I don't think really has much reality around it anymore. There's a strange context around sport, which I'm constantly marveling at. And again, one of the things that we really found in the duty of care review, we suddenly realized that sport has created a cocoon around itself where certain types of behaviors that would be considered egregious in almost any other context become not just allowable, but you almost think it's odd if they're missing. There's really good examples where you can think of if a child, I know many of you in the room are not old enough to have children, but if a child, your child, came home from school with a story of, I was in French class. I don't know. We're in Canada, so I know they do that. But in America, do we do languages still? There are other places. I just want to point that out. It's important for you to know. They come home, they've taken French, and they come home with the story of a French teacher who pushed them up against a wall. It was so close to their face that they could feel the breath and spittle on the side of their cheek as they yelled about why you can't conjugate the right verbs. And the thing is, in that context, we know what would happen. A, there's a lawsuit coming. It's North America, after all. There's a lawsuit coming, but we are going down to that school, and there will be hell to pay. And the problem is that while there's four walls and carpet or a firm floor, that's the rule. But the moment sport is in play, maybe there's grass, maybe there's a court, maybe there's just sweating. All of a sudden, the context changed, and you can have a kid who will come home with a story about how coach pushed them up against the wall and yelled at them, and instead of there being a sense that a child has been violated, there will actually be anger at the young person. What did you do to make the coach so mad? In that context, we have to be careful we don't drink the Kool-Aid, that we don't start overlooking things because the context is so shifted. One of the other things that we found outside of this, in that context, is the idea that we reframe incidents. We saw constantly responsible people who really did care, and in this picture there were some sports psychologists and there were other people who had a duty of care for young people who missed significant incidents that had led to some of the larger events that had reached media prominence, including the gymnastics scandal and others in America, but also within the UK. They'd missed things because they knew sport was good, they knew that the context was different, so they reframed small incidents that should have been automatic triggers for them that something terrible was about to happen. They reframed their ability to insert themselves and try and shortcut things because they knew that sport was okay and this is just a natural part of it. And so terrible things happened right under their nose, which is really quite crazy. One of the things that's closest to me in terms of our vigilance of sport is that sport seems designed to squash our identity into something unitary. Sport wants us to be what we do. It wants athletes to define themselves by their what is essentially their occupation at the elite level, whether it be high school, college, or professional. And I had a very different experience, because I knew when I came to Penn State, when I came to America indeed, I already knew I was going to be a psychologist. That I'd known since I was 7. So when I played sport, I was a psychologist who played basketball. I was never a basketball player. And I would be insulted, and I maintain to this day, I will be insulted if you ever call me a basketball player. And it was a protective factor for me, because it meant that I constantly looked at the world around me. And when people said to me things about performance-enhancing drugs, when people said things to me about, I don't know, taking hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to this university versus this university, all of that was not part of my picture, because I knew that I wasn't just a basketball player. And sport seems to work very hard to turn you into someone who fits. And that's a weird definition of that, really. Someone who fits in sport. Someone who's not very clever, doesn't aspire academically too much. I was constantly, not at Penn State, but certainly when I was in the pros, I was studying for my doctorate while I was in the MBA, which is not anywhere near as, I say it and it always sounds really cool, but it's nowhere near as challenging as you think. There's an immense amount of downtime in the MBA. And you are well taken care of, so all I have to do is sit on a plane and study. It's easy. But even as I played in the NBA, I had sit-downs with 3 different coaches who questioned my commitment to basketball, despite the fact that I was doing my 8 hours of training and studying on a plane instead of playing Nintendo. They questioned my commitment. It was almost like they wanted to push me back into this box. And it's increasingly obvious now that there are a couple of types of athlete that you can be and fit. You can be the singular athlete who knows that they're an athlete, and that's the most important thing, and anything that comes after will come after. It's usually poorly planned for. Or you can be the troubled athlete. People like the troubled athlete. I hate Stephen A. Smith. I say this unguardedly. He knows this. But he said something quite astute the other day, which really hurts my soul. When he pointed out that in professional sports, no one wants a Kaepernick. And it's not because he's troublesome, it's because he's principled and plural. Oh, your dogs can rip each other's throats out, and you can be welcome back. You can beat up your wife, and you can be welcome back, because if you do something terrible, you suddenly become eminently controllable. Whereas where is the control over Kaepernick? It doesn't exist. He has principles. We have to be the guardians of that kind of plurality of interest for our athletes, to make sure that student athlete isn't making a mockery of that mixed up word. To make sure that they have the opportunity to explore what life is beyond running and jumping and throwing a ball in a hole. One of the most sobering moments of my career, it probably was at Penn State, was when I realized how silly what I did was. I just reached that stage where I was absolutely soaking up the adulation. I loved walking. I would purposefully take the long route through campus to get to any class after a good game, because I knew that everybody would be like, Meech! That's what they called me. I don't know. Apparently, John is too difficult. But Meech, and people would like, yeah, way to go. And I just loved it. I was a solar panel for their praise. It was amazing. And then I suddenly realized one day, I put a ball in a hole. I mean, really consider that. I put a ball in a hole. I did it for 15 years. I mean, people talk, they often, why do you kind of move on? Why do you do all the stuff you do? And it's like, yeah, I've got some making up to do. I put a ball in a hole for 15 years, and I must make up for it. And I'm an atheist. I don't even believe in that heaven and hell stuff. I simply think that, good Lord, I have limited time left. I must do something good with it. But part of that is the fact that I had a particular type of mum who helped instill with me the idea that what I did is not who I am. So even though I felt under constant pressure to narrow myself, to be just the athlete, to be more controllable, I've been this ornery since then. I think there's a duty of care for each of us as practitioners to help athletes be able to buck the squashing of their identity that's going to happen to them. The last thing I would say about the identity thing is the other part we found is in transition. Everybody loves to talk about transition and what we do with transition. And the biggest problem, I think, with transition is not this cliff edge where the skills aren't there, or for professional athletes, you've been pandered all your life and you haven't had to do any of these things like pay bills or whatever. Those are tangible things. But the biggest problem is that if you are what you do, if your occupation is your definition, when you stop doing it, you don't just stop doing something, you stop being something. You end your career and all of a sudden you aren't the same person anymore. You notice how the adulation withers. How one day, your first few days, it's fine because people are like, oh yes, you were awesome. But then eventually you find that the only people who do that are twice your age and they're talking about 1990. And you suddenly realize you are living in the past and you have no real identity moving forward. No wonder that medication with sex and alcohol and any number of other things comes for so many athletes after transition. I'm bound to talk about inclusion since I think I am far more famous for being a gay athlete than I am for being anything else, frankly, which is depressing. I can tell you with some conviction that being gay took little to no effort. So it's unfortunate that that's kind of where I'm pigeonholed, at least in North America. But inclusion in sport, I've already mentioned that we lag behind the investment banks, which I think is really depressing. But there's a couple of things I think are important. I want to tell you why I got involved in basketball in the first place. I'm from England. It is not a country known for its basketball to this day, unfortunately, despite us having far more prominent and brilliant athletes potentially than I. I live my life with three main reactions. The first is abject terror. People are afraid of me. And you will all be thinking, I wouldn't be afraid of you, and that's because we've laughed together now, and I have doctor in front of my name, and letters afterwards that you don't really understand, but you know must be important. And so you wouldn't possibly be afraid, except I do this a lot, and I do this, and then I leave the hotel, and I will see people with their lanyards on, so I know they've just heard me speak, and they'll be 30 meters away. That is some distance. And they'll see me, and they'll cross the street. And then when they get to about 10 meters away, that is a shorter distance, they will cross back over. Because in their head, they've done the calculation, 30 meters, massive black dude, danger Will Robinson, cross the road. And then at 10 meters, it's one of the safe ones. And they cross back over. So people are afraid of me. People mock me a lot, which is, depressing. They walk past me and then 5 steps later, you'll see them turning around and trying to take pictures, so like I'm a circus freak. And then the third thing that happens, especially if I'm not in a suit, is that people will speak to me very slowly, like I'm fresh off the boat. And in combination, it's quite depressing, right? And that was my life when I was 11. I felt like a monster with every interaction. It's still true to this day. I'm simply more psychologically resilient than I was. But I started sport because I met somebody on the street, and I expected him to do the same stupid stuff that people do on the street all the time, which they come up to me and they say, "Oh, God, you're tall," which is an incredibly dumb thing to say. And instead, this man came up to me and he said, "You'd be great at basketball." And my life really revolves around two things, and they are books and pie. Those two things, I love those two things. Right? And this man came to me and proposed a sport which I knew did not involve books and pie, and I knew would involve the two things that were my nemesis, exertion and sweat. And yet, I was sucked into that world simply because instead of all the stupid stuff that I normally face, you know, the Cooley research, the looking glass self research, I love, it's super old, 1902, but still, where he talks about our identity being formed of how we see ourselves reflected in the faces of other people. I looked in this man's face and I searched for the monster and I could not see it. And I thought, if there's a chance that I can walk into a place where when I look into people's face, I never see the monster, I must enter that space. And so I did. I went to this gym in Chorlton. It's near Manchester. You don't care. And I walked in, and everything stopped. Kids were playing basketball. Everything stopped. Just one solitary ball, bounce, 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 into the corner. And then they looked at me, and then they ran towards me, which in my experience is a bad thing. And as I'm trying to back out of this room, they grab me by the arms, which in my experience is a bad thing. And they start yelling, "He's on our team." And I swear to you, in that moment, my heart nearly exploded. I was like, this is amazing. And then I felt guilt, because I'm like, well, I should probably tell them. I don't know what basketball is. And so I said, I don't know what basketball is. And they're like, no, you'll be great. And I was like, my God, there it is again. They gave me the ball. My first experience was a thud and a clap. They passed me the ball and it hit me in the chest and I missed it. It just bounced on the floor and people looked. And someone said, "You'll get it next time." I pick it up and I pass it. Next time I catch it, and I believe that this is part of the whole basketball thing, like catching is a point or something. So I catch it and I'm just like, yeah, second time, right? At some point somebody yells at me, "Shoot." And I have to look at one of my teammates and say, yes, what is shoot? That's how no sport I was. He said, just throw this into that. So I threw it up, and one of those magical moments where physics stops working and time slows down and the ball rotates. And I missed by about 6 feet. And in that environment, there's a kid called Jamie who just yelled, "My God, that's his first shot, and he only missed by 6 feet." We know this now. That's the Dweck kind of growth mindset stuff, right? And there it was in the 80s. And I just looked around, and I looked at the people's faces, and I'm searching for the monster, and all I can see is my own potential. In a sport that I don't even understand, in a route that I have no idea about. But I said to myself, I am never leaving this place. I'm never leaving this place. And this is the danger that we must be careful of, because that inclusion is seductive. If someone had told me that steroids was the way to stay in this space, I would have done that. If someone had told me that skipping school would have done this, I would have done that. If someone had told me anything, I would have done it. The reason I went to the MBA, then I went to America, was simply because I thought, if this slightly urine-smelling gym in an obscure part of South Manchester is this good, then surely it would be even better in California where the sun shines. And that's why I played in the NBA. You can imagine my disappointment when I realized that the environment of that doesn't necessarily last. I vividly remember my high school teacher. I went to 1 year of high school in this country, in Toledo, Ohio. Don't laugh, it's not exotic, but it was formative. And I remember him pulling me to the side one day and just saying to me, "John, enjoy this year, because it will be the last time you play sport for fun." And he was absolutely right. For many high schoolers, even that's too late to make that statement. This is not to say I never had fun playing sport after that, but I never played sport for fun after that. A remarkable difference. So I've got 11 minutes up on here. My question is, do I have 11 minutes to keep talking and then there's questions? Or do I have 11 minutes for questions? Choose the right answer. Keep talking? All right, I'm going to keep talking. After all, what are you going to do, right? The inclusion part of sport, there's another element to this, and who's to blame for sport not being inclusive? I know we don't have interactive powers at this point, but we often, when we look at the narrative, we often blame urban, read black kids are the problem. That's why the sport's not inclusive, because black people hate gay people, right? Or it's fans. You know, fans, they're all blue collar and therefore stupid and ignorant and bigoted. And it's their fault. And I think it's really worth examining whose fault is it that sport isn't inclusive? It has the money to do it if it wanted to. It has the power, almost unilateral across many of the organizations, to do if they want to. And certainly by the wonderful words that they write, inclusion and diversity is in every stanza of most of the charters and principles of sport. So it's weird that it's not happened yet. Strange. We think it's the athletes, but we know when we talk about the experience of LGBT athletes that in many environments they come out and are embraced on their sports teams. My sports team, when I was in Orlando, people have a very difficult time understanding if you're British or gay. They do. They have a hard time with it. It's more frustrating when you're British and gay, let me tell you. So most of the time when I played, my weirdness, because I am eminently weird, and my Britishness meant that it was like a perception fog that you couldn't possibly tell that I'm also gay. But I was playing for the Orlando Magic, and we're on a road trip, and one of these trips, I notice, I look up from my laptop, and I notice that everybody is gone. The coaches sit way at the front. Everybody else kind of spreads themselves out in this massive plane with about 25 seats, and there's a little space at the back where you know, that's not really used. And I look at the front, the coaches are chatting away, and I look behind, and the entire team is back there. I'm like, that's never good. And then one of the players kind of walks up the aisle towards me, and I pretend not to have noticed that they've all gone, and I'm just typing away. And then he, Meech. And I was like, yeah. He said, so you don't talk much about women. And I said, indeed. And he said, cool, got it. Then walked back to the rest of my team and relayed the news, and that was it. That was my entire coming out to my team. Absolutely nothing changed after that. I do remember, you know, it was lovely to see people make mild efforts that were always very, very straight man, totally uncomfortable in that space. So you seeing anyone? Please don't answer that question. It was always implicit. But it was lovely. And think, this was way back when. And yes, there was the Tim Hardaways of that time. And I think we have to face the fact that the sport hasn't moved on in terms of inclusion because those in charge of the sport are pretty comfortable with where it is right now. And I've got to be clear with you, I don't care about inclusion as a Benetton ad, right? Which is what most sports organizations do, right? They do a Benetton ad. Black, white, wheelchair, gay, done. I'm not interested from that perspective. I'm interested from a performance perspective. Having the diversity of thought, having the opportunity that's created by an inclusive environment. where not just LGBT people and black people can deliver their best, but introverted males aren't prioritized for the way their brain works. So this is what I want to do. There's other things that I have here, but there's no time, and I do want to give you a chance to ask some questions. Here's what I want you to do. If we don't take for granted that sport is good, it changes our levels of vigilance with our people. If we question whether in our practice prior to this moment, who has been our stakeholder, it changes how we operate. Have our athlete clients always been our stakeholder? Or is it the AD? Is it the coach? Is it the institution? I think you guess from my talk so far who I think the stakeholder has to be in order to maintain their duty of care. Because I think only people like you in the room have the purpose-driven and academic background to ensure that you can see through the fog of these myths and make sure that you are the one who helps athletes develop in the way that they should, despite a system that wants to squash them into a compliant little ball. If we don't take it for granted that sport is good, we will see the tiny infractions against athletes or that potentially can harm athletes differently. The example I have for this is this. I live in central London in Covent Garden, and because we're an inclusive workplace, sometimes flex working happens and I work from home, and at lunchtime I'll stand on my balcony and I'll look over this amazing courtyard where there's tons of professional services firms, and I'll watch people in their lanyards come out, and they will, because some idiot has told people in workplaces that a 20-minute lunch is good for productivity, they'll come out and they'll have this cigarette and they'll be sucking on this cigarette like nobody's business. And I'll watch, and what do they do after they finish their cigarette? Interactive part. Yeah, throw it on the floor. So is littering okay? Is dropping rubbish okay? Who thinks dropping rubbish is okay? This is curious to me because you live in places, right? You live in places, you've been outside this hotel. It is clear that littering is, it's interesting because I think what you thought I was asking is littering illegal, which it certainly is. But it's also clearly okay, and we know this because when that person drops their cigarette, often you'll see one person that sees them. They'll see them drop the cigarette and they'll do this. And what do? And then they walk away and they leave it there. Sometimes two people see it, and it's even better because then two people see the cigarette drop. And you'll see two people who've noticed it and they'll go, pff. But neither of them picks it up. And then I watch another day when I come, and now there's two cigarette butts and maybe a sandwich packet, and then the next day there's some more, and the next day there's some, and you wait 2 weeks in central London, and all of a sudden there's a burning mattress right there. And now everybody's paying attention because there's a burning mattress, and so even the person who comes out to have a cigarette is like, this is disgusting. This is terrible, this should never, and we want to find people, right, to say, this is, come on now, this is awful. But then we do this thing where we're absolutely sure we can't solve this problem. This is too big for us to solve this. This is a systemic problem. We can't solve this problem. So we'll look at it disapprovingly, but it's not us. We can't do anything. So who's going to sort this out? And then eventually a regulatory body of some description, if you live where I live, pretty quick, shows up and moves it all away, and the next day you come out and you're just in the shadow of this dumpster fire that happened in the middle of things. And so there you are, and you look at each other like, this is how it should be. Good. And even if you're wearing the same lanyard as this person, you let them do it. And this is the nature of culture change. This is why sport is riddled with dumpster fires right now. In gymnastics, across the board. And we love the dumpster fires because they promote in us a sense of great validation of our virtue with no obligation for action. Because that's too big. I'm not in that university. I couldn't possibly do anything about it. Even if I am, it's a catastrophic system failure, and I'm not. But it is. Because these dumpster fires, they start with tiny behaviors that because of the context of sport, we overlook. Oh, it's no big deal. That little piece of bullying that went on. That little touch of coercion. That making that athlete perform when they really shouldn't. These tiny things that happen, and we let them go because of the context of sport, and then we marvel at the dumpster fire and hold our hands up and say, no, I didn't like that. What we don't realize is the stuff that we let go is the stuff that starts that off. There's a tremendous power that each of you have, and I hope you realize it. My experience is that most of you don't, both because of probably some of your experiences, but also because, and I did notice this earlier, you're tiny people. I don't mean status, I just mean physically, you're minuscule. And it's not your fault. Technically, it's your mother's fault. Primary contributor to your just tininess. And my experience with tiny people is that you don't have very good spatial awareness. I've watched you today, not in a creepy way, but I've watched you around the hotel, and it's fascinating to watch you because you probably don't do it, but there's a Brownian motion experiment where you put smoke in a Petri dish and you watch it through nobody cares. Anyway, and you do it to see, show molecules of air bouncing off stuff, and you see these particles of dust bouncing, and that's what you do, that's you. I was watching, you're on your phones, you've got your coffee, you're talking to your friends, and you're walking, and you bump, boom, oh, sorry, and then you off in a different, sorry. And I think it's because you're all the same kind of tiny. Conservation of energy, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. Nothing happens. The danger of that is that you start to believe that your interpersonal interactions are inconsequential. It's a real danger for tiny people. Giants don't have that. We are ultimately aware. Everything about me is super contained. Because I know tiny people, and I don't know why this is, they love to gather in my blind spots. If I stand still for more than 2 minutes, I guarantee you there's a tiny person right here. And it means I have to be careful. I don't know why they do it. I think they think I'm like a reef or something, and they're in my lee. I think there's something quite nice about people thinking there's a safe space around me. But it does mean that I have to be careful, because if somebody comes up to me and says, where's such and such, I can't just go, it's over there, because if I do that and you're here, you're going to die. So the reason I say this is because you have to break out of the trap of thinking that you're a tiny person. I've explained to you how Dave, Sandy, any number of people helped me survive at a time when I thought I couldn't possibly. My mother passed away while I was in college. I just thought it was the end. It was like the literal sun had gone out in my galaxy. And yet there were giants there, quietly, standing, so I, in that time, could shelter in their lee. You have a profound ability with your expertise, with your insights, with your vigilance, to have a remarkable impact on the young people and the adults that you work with. And they need that in the context of the sport that I've described today, which I do not think is hyperbole. They need you to recognize that you're giants, that nothing you do will be inconsequential, that even sometimes the look of reassurance you give them will be the bolster that they need. When you help them to be plural instead of narrow, when you help them to see a life beyond sport, when others are trying to keep them focused only on one thing, when you remind them constantly about the transition, that they are not what they do, when you support them on, field or court and off, you're going to have this profound impact. So, my clock says 0. I'm ignoring it. Do we have time for questions, or should I get off? We do? All right, good. So, I have more, but let's do questions. See what happens. We don't have time for this. Questions. I like to promise a weird experience, so I hope it's been that so far. Good.
How you doing, sir? Mario from University of Central Florida. I grew up watching you play for the Magic also.
I'm sorry.
I remember like in around like 2000 though that you could have signed with the Lakers, but you didn't. Do you ever regret that? Because you only played for us for like 2 seasons.
Thank you for bringing up that painful memory. Before I played for the Magic, nobody wanted me. I could not beg a team to give me a shot. The Magic gave me a shot. I don't believe in loyalty. I think it's a weird, manipulative arrangement. It's got a false kind of mutuality to it. I do believe in principle. And I always go around, you may have noticed my moralizing even at that time, talking about being a full-time person of principle. It's one of my mantras. The problem with that is that sometimes you get tested. Now sometimes the test is there's one bottle of milk left and you give it to the old lady because she clearly needs the calcium. It's a sacrifice, but not one too far. And then other times, someone offers you, $20 million. And you have to go with what your principle is, which is, I said to Doc Rivers that I would stay with the Magic because I believe I would not have been in the NBA without his intervention, and therefore this is my principles in play. I was very clear with him that it wasn't about loyalty. You can't be a part-time person of principle. If your principles waver the moment something of real consequence is on the line, you're not principled, you're a blackguard. Plus, I knew I was going to be a psychologist, and I knew that I would work with people who were suspicious of psychologists, and they would ask me, can I trust you? What is your word worth? And I would tell them, about $20 million.
Thank you.
No time for that. No time for that. Next question, please.
Hi, I see that you started your own foundation that's with physical activity and community. So I'm wondering what the values of your foundation are and how you ensure that those are actually acted and not just words on paper.
Yep. Oh. Well, I have 2 things to say about that. One is a little sad and one is good. So when I started it, it was very clear to me that what I wanted to do was produce emotionally literate, intellectually curious young people with the skills to interact well with their peers and adults. That was the goal of the organization. Not very sporty, I know, but we wanted to use sport to constantly deliver those messages. I no longer have a foundation in the UK because it was clear to me they became more interested in being the best basketball in England, which is such a curious thing, really, because being the best basketball in England is like being the best smelling poo. It's not a race you want to win. Whereas producing emotionally literate, intellectually curious young people, that would always be gold standard. So my name isn't on that building anymore, and it's not a part of that foundation. But that's my conviction to making sure that the words are lived.
Thank you.
My name is Steve Walker. I'm from Boulder, Colorado, and I am curious. When we look at our role in our society and the people that we interact with, the student athletes, especially the athletes themselves, then there are coaches, athletic directors, administrators at all different levels, including owners of franchises. When you start looking at what would be the biggest impact that could, in fact, change our world as a social role. Where do you think we should start? What do you think would be the biggest impact the quickest? Because Lord knows there's a lot of need.
Okay, that's not a Twitter-sized answer. What will be the biggest impact? Do you mean in sports or using sports?
I think we have to keep it within the context.
Okay. One of the biggest impacts could be to actually let athletes, facilitate athletes being role models. The Kaepernick situation really reveals the insidious hypocrisy of sport. Because I remember constantly being told that I was a role model the moment I got to America. England, less so. Especially if you look at Premier League football players, but that's a different conversation for a different time. I was constantly told at Penn State, it's your job to give back, it's your job to set an example. And it was really fascinating that we seem to be in a place where if that setting example consists of selling young people blue sugar water with zero nutritional value and totally unnecessary for their performance, then that's good. If it's selling them shoes made by Cambodian children, then that is good. But if it's using your platform to stand up for the indiscriminate and disproportionate assassination of young black people by the police, then that's not being a role model. I think if we facilitated athletes being role models at the very earliest stages by giving them skills, helping them realize that it is not just a burden, it is a revelation to me. The idea that as a giant, I have to be a little more vigilant so I don't accidentally wound people. But I also have the power to lift people into the sunshine. I have the power to raise other people's voices who never have a chance of being heard. It's a remarkable privilege and worth every second of inconvenience of being slightly contained. If we could help athletes realize that, I think many more would find ways, and very small ways, I'm not talking about LeBron's school and Kaepernick's stand, tiny ways on a daily basis from high school on through, that we would have these radiators of ethics, radiators of principle, who themselves would find themselves less compromised and would see that they have value beyond their ability to put a ball in a hole. I think.
Thank you. This is a similar question, but I've been standing up here, so I'm going to say it anyway. If we have to report to athletic directors, coaches, and we want to be principled and follow your message, but still have a job at the end of the day, what are some things we can do to work within a system from the inside without disrupting it too much at the beginning, but kind of having these sustained small steps?
Yeah, it is a real challenge. I think you have to show athletic directors and coaches especially, because they are not where you are in terms of their understanding. You have to show them how what you're doing, whilst it seems mildly inconvenient in the short term, delivers progress for them in the long term. You have to lead them to that water and then shove their head in it so they drink it. That's what we have to do, because until they realize, oh, you're interested in job security past the 18 months that's the average for a D1 coach? Here's how I'm going to help you. Your best player, oh, they're thinking about transferring. Yeah, they're in a psychologically unsafe environment. We can do something about that. You can stop being a dick, and I can help you. I would modify the language, but we can help them see how you're an asset for their performance, and not just in terms of, hey, this kid can't shoot free throws, because you are more than that. So much more than that. The tools that you have to bring on so many different facets of coaching and athlete life, the contributions you can make to their pedagogy, how they teach, are remarkable. They just don't know it because they think you're there to stop them being nervous before a game. And we need to educate them. No, you're an idiot. This is what I can do. Here's my bag of tricks. And here's how specifically it's going to help you. And there will be things in this trick. I'm going to come with the ones that are all easy for you because you don't have to do anything. But then I'm going to start with the ones that you have to do. I think that's what we need to do. Show them our bag of tricks and help them realize how it feeds their bottom line.
Thank you.
Hi, Julia Cothra from Indiana University. I love that you talked about needing to be giants. I think there is possibly an assumption that it's safe for all of us to be giants in the systems that we work in. And I know that we have to be brave. I'm assuming that you've had to be brave in your career, being a giant in certain spaces, and I'm wondering what tips and tricks we can take from your experience.
I don't think it's about being brave. I think being a giant is about recognizing the fact that somebody will see you as a giant. Maybe not everybody. And it's not about asserting yourself. People think it's about asserting yourself. And I think I've tried to tell you that it's actually about sometimes not asserting yourself. It's sometimes about being contained instead of being gregarious and big and whatever else. I don't prowl stages because I know what it does to people when I do that. So it's not about becoming more noticeable to your administrators. It's not about arguing every single point, but it is about recognizing that almost everything you do will have a disproportionate impact. That's really the key. And also, you won't be able to predict and prepare for the times that it will really matter. Again, I'm wildly over time, but I'll tell one more story and then I promise I'll leave, right? So, this may help. Yes, wise move. Please do sit, because this will take a second. This may help. When I played for the Orlando Magic, that was my heyday. If you don't know anything about it, I was awesome. But when I first got there, they weren't sure they were going to keep me. And you know how it is. There's the depth chart on the wall, the whiteboard with the different positions and the names underneath them. And I walked into the coach's office and I saw underneath, oh, my name is last, under 4 and 5. That is not good. This is pre-season, and we're not going to have all these players when season comes around. And I'm not going home. So I used to practice with the team and then eat lunch and then practice on my own in the gym that was right next door but was public, because I didn't want the coaches to see me practice. It's a really odd thing, process that one. Like it was weakness that I was having to practice more. So there I am in the gym and I'm running and I'm doing my whatever shots and whatever, and suddenly my spider sense is tingling and I see 2 kids walking in the gym, and it's a public gym. It's just that 2 o'clock in the afternoon, normal people are at work and kids are at school, so nobody should be in my gym. And there they are. And I look at them and I'm immediately furious. Like, why are you here in my gym? And then I do that thought that athletes often have, like, don't you know who I am? And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm bottom of the depth chart. Probably doesn't know who I am. And they looked at me and they gave me this look that every practitioner in this room should recognize, every parent, every manager of people should recognize. The look they give you when it's like, I really want you to talk to me, but I'm afraid to come up and talk to you. I'm afraid to hold this look with you in case you're going to look away and pretend you didn't see me. And I was so close to doing it, and then I realized, you know, that's not what my mom would do. So I called them over, and you know how I called them over? That. And these 2 kids, they ran towards me, across, and they came up to me, and they introduced themselves. Hi, I'm Chris. Hi, I'm Eric. I'm like, hi, I'm John. I was wearing all magic stuff. That's what you do when you're insecure. It's like, yeah. I'm with the magic. And they talked a little bit and said, do you want to, you know, will you play? And I kind of like, I've really got to work. And I was like, what should I do? All right, let's just do 5 minutes. And they wanted to play, you know, 2-on-1. So these kids were 10, 11. And so we played 2-on-1. I just killed them. After the 5 minutes, I was like, right, I've got to go. No complaints. They scurried off. Thanks. Scurried off. I went about my business. Every day I did this. A couple of days later, maybe 3 or 4 days later, there they were again. They scurry over. I say, hey, Chris, Eric, why aren't you in school? They're like, no, we're good. It's like, not my kids, not my problem. So I let them go, and we played a little bit, killed them again. Anyway, long story short, I got to know these kids over the course of a full year. I got up the depth chart. At the end of the year, I'm starting, and everything's amazing. And these kids, I know that their circumstance is terrible. And I bring them to England to come to my basketball camp. And the second day of the camp, Chris breaks his ankle. And on the way to the hospital, he's screaming in pain. And then he looks at me and he says, will you take care of us? And I'm thinking, no, not really, no. I am top of the depth chart and pretty comfortable not having children. I said I'd think about it, which was unsatisfying as an answer to him. I went home and I didn't sleep. I came back the next day. I said yes. I ended up adopting Chris and Eric. And I'm a granddad of 5 now, which is ridiculous. I look good for it. Anyway, the whole point of that is, a few years ago, I went to Thanksgiving at their house, and apparently after Thanksgiving, the thing to do in North America is to go onto the men go onto the veranda to talk. So we went onto the veranda to talk, and it was weird, and I was like, what's going on? What's going on? And they looked at me and they said, do you know why we chose you? Which is weird, because I thought I chose them. Right? Do you know why we chose you? And so I did that thing where we think we can predict and prepare for the important interactions. And I'm like, firstly, instant NBA dad. How cool is that? And they looked at me and they were like, you weren't that good. Which is true, but cruel. And so my mind is going again. What's the next moment that matters? Because that's what we do, even as practitioners. What are the moments that matter? Our lives are too busy to do every moment. What's the moment that matters? So I'm like, you don't know this. 7 hours I stayed up the night when you asked me that question. Thought about it, and they laughed. I'm like, no. That's not it. Well, what is it then? Do you remember the first time we met? I said, of course I do. Should have been in school. Do you remember the second time we met? I said, yeah, of course. We knew you were the one. We knew you'd take care of us. Because the second time we met, you remembered our names. I'm a granddad of 5 because I remembered somebody's name. When I thought other things were more important. When I thought priorities were shifted and reordered. When I thought my personal success was more important than their individual development. This is the nature of our job as practitioners. You are disproportionately powerful. You will never know, for the most part, the moments that you do something profound that helps somebody forever. You'll never know. I'm not suggesting this is a means for you to have additional children. I am saying to you that as you battle with the ideas of my institution, my AD, or my kids, there's no answer to that question except who is our stakeholder in this environment that is not optimized for the well-being and the duty of care of our athletes. If the athletes are not our stakeholder, I fear that they don't have one. It must be us. Go forth, be giants.